Hello and welcome to this video demonstration of using SQL Server 2005 Analysis Services with the Project Server 2007 Cube Building Service. In part 1 of this demonstration, we'll take a look at creating an Analysis Services repository. This includes creating a repository database in SQL Server, creating a login for the Olap users group, and making that login a DB owner of the repository database. We'll also create the required database schema, and we'll configure repository connection parameters in Analysis Services. Before we get started, let's take a quick look at the infrastructure that we'll be using for this demonstration. We have 4 computers. The first is Litware DC, and this is the domain controller for the litware.local domain. Now, we don't actually need access to the domain controller for anything in this demonstration, but our farm is on a domain. The second computer is Litware Proj, and in part 2 of this video series, we'll be installing the necessary prerequisites on this computer to get the Cube Building service working. The third computer is Litware-SQL. This is the computer that's running SQL Server and Analysis Services, and here in part 1 of this video series, we'll be using this computer to configure the Analysis Services repository database. And the fourth computer is Litware Client. And in part 2 of this series, we'll be taking a look at the configuration steps necessary for client computers so that Project Server users can view Olap data. Now to get started with the repository configuration, let's head over to the computer running Analysis Services. Now I'm going to log into the server using my farm administrator's account because I happen to know that that account is a local administrator on all the computers in our farm. And it's just a best practice to use that account when doing various farm maintenance procedures. So the first thing we need to do is to create an Analysis Services repository database in SQL Server. So I'm going to click Start, All Programs, SQL Server, and we'll open Management Studio. Now to create the database, I just right-click Databases and click New Database. And I'm just going to call it Analysis Services Repository. And click OK. And then I need to go up to the Security node, expand Security, go to Logins, right-click, and then choose New Login. And what we want to do here is to make the Olap users group the owner of the database. So in login name, I want to enter the Olap users group. The easiest way to do that is to come down here, go to Administrative Tools, Computer Management, go to Local Users and Groups, double-click Groups, and then as we come down here and look in this area with a lot of SQL Server accounts, we'll see this one which says MS Olap User, and this is the account that we want. So if I click on this a second time, it will select the text, and I can click Copy, and then go back here, click Search, and then I can just paste that value right here. Now, because this is a group, I need to go up to Object Types and select Groups because by default it's only going to search on users and built-in security principles. So I'll click OK, click Check Names, it's found the group, click OK again, and that's the login name that we want to use. Now we want to go up to User Mapping. We want to select this first database, Analysis Services Repository, which is the database that we just created. Select the map option. And then down here under role membership, we want to give it DB owner membership. And I'll click OK. Now the next thing we need to do is to give our new database the appropriate schema. So to do that, I'm going to go up to New Query, select our database, Analysis Services Repository, as the database in which to run the query. And I happen to know that in the TechNet article that describes this process, there is that query that we need to do this. So I'm going to go to TechNet, and this topic is requirements for using SQL Server 2005 analysis services with the Project Server 2007 queue building service. And I'm going to scroll down, and right here is the transact SQL statement that I need to use to give the database the correct schema. So I'm just going to select this, click copy, go back to Management Studio, paste it, and then click execute. And we can see that the query was successful. Now that the database is set up, we need to tell analysis services to actually use this database as its repository. So I'm going to go back down to Start, All Programs, SQL Server, and I'm going to open another copy of Management Studio. And this time, I'm going to choose to log into Analysis Services. And here we need to configure the repository connection strings. So I'm going to go up to the top node here, right-click, click Properties, and then I want to select the Show Advanced Properties option. Now I'm going to expand out the name column a little bit so we can see things a little better here. And I'll scroll down a bit. And what we're interested in are DSO Remote Repository Connection String and DSO Repository Connection String. So I'm going to select the value box here and click this button. I'll type in the name of our SQL server. And then from the drop-down list, under Connect to a Database, I want, of course, my Analysis Services repository. Click OK. And then again, for DSO Repository Connection String, I want to do exactly the same thing. And that's all I need to do here, so I'll click OK. Now we're all done with the repository setup for analysis services. The next thing that I want to do is to install some prerequisites on the computer running project server. We'll be doing that in part 2 of this video series. To quickly recap what we did here in part 1, we configured our analysis services repository by creating a database for the repository in SQL Server, creating a login for the Olap users group and giving that login DB owner permissions on the repository database. Then we ran a query to create the correct schema and configured our repository connection parameters in analysis services. In part 2 of this series, we'll take a look at the configuration steps necessary for project server itself and for client computers where users will need to be able to access Olap data. That concludes part 1 of this video series using SQL Server 2005 analysis services with the Project Server 2007 queue building service.